Walking along an epic path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take an epic fork in the road. Approaching the Anselm Society Digital Pub, you take one epic breath before opening the oaken door. Inside is an epic conversation on the arts, faith, and why people started using the word epic so often a few years back. At a corner table, by the fire, are three people. One of them is trying and failing to make it through the preface of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And that person is me, Matthew Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Anselm Society is a coalition of churches across the Front Range of Colorado dedicated to one very simple goal, a renaissance of the Christian imagination. To further this goal, we do all sorts of things. Each spring, fingers crossed for COVID this upcoming spring, we have our big Imagination Redeemed conference, which attracts folks from all across the country. We also have, again, usual COVID caveats, a regular slate of concerts, lectures, and other events designed to foster love and understanding of arts and faith. And we have our own Guild of Artists right here in Colorado Springs. And when we in the Arts Guild aren't creating art, some of us like to podcast. Therefore, Believe to See. To find out more about the Anselm Society, please visit us at anselmsociety.org. And while you're there, why don't you check out our other two podcasts, Redeemed Imagination and Speaking with Joy. And since you're already doing stuff, go ahead and rate and review the show on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. That helps us so much. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate it when we get your 5-star reviews. Really, really love to see them. So go ahead and do that. Why the heck not? But, that's, you probably heard my spiel by now. Joined here by Evangeline Denmark. Evangeline, how are you doing today?
I am hanging in there.
Hanging in there. Well, I don't want to make this all about me, but I'm doing the exact same thing. And You can ask me about it if you want to know why I'm stressed.
Oh, why are you stressed, Matt?
Well, as we're recording, because I'm dedicated to the podcast, we're recording while the Nuggets are playing the Lakers in Game 3 of the Western Conference Finals. The Nuggets are my favorite team. The Lakers are my least favorite team. The stakes could not be higher. If we lose, we'll fall behind in the series 3-0, and it'll essentially be over. And we lost the last game off of a last-second buzzer beater by Anthony Davis, who I just loathe entirely. The basketball player, not the person, sports hate, but I'm in a stressful place right now.
So you're saying this is an epic game that you're missing?
It is an epic game, but I kind of enjoy missing it because I don't take these very well. I pace back and forth and get all tense and irritable, and I don't like where I go. So I have...
That doesn't sound like fun at all.
It really isn't. I wonder why I do this to myself sometimes. But I'll be checking in on the score as we go. So if I suddenly get in a really good or bad mood, then you know why. But Evangeline, let's hashtag real talk right here.
Okay.
When is the last time you have read an epic poem?
Well, I've been doing a little bit of homework for this podcast. It also kind of dovetails with my, my novel project. So I have kind of dived into the Toyn, which is Toyn Bo Cooling.
Okay.
The Cattle Raid of Cooley, which is an Irish epic. But before this past week, I think the last time I read an epic poem was in college, and that would have been Beowulf. So, yes, it's been a little while.
I love the Irish epics. I'm going to imply that I've read them all in detail, but I've sort of glanced through them. But I have some research projects that I need to go through this stuff too. So I'll sort of skim through the Wikipedia and then pretend that I've read them. But I love those Irish myths to pieces. My favorite thing is the concept of the warp spasm. Are you up on the warp spasm talk? Oh, it's so cool. I ran across
it and I was like, what in the world? So I have not Googled that yet. I'm a little afraid. Can you explain the warp spasm, or is it not something that should be explained via podcast?
It's hard to explain using my words on a podcast, but basically the warp spasm is the inhuman, otherworldly distortion and horror that overcomes the face of a hero in the heat of battle. Blood shoots out of his eyes, and his hair sets on fire. I maybe Google it. It could be a dangerous thing to Google. I think it's safe to Google it. When I came across it, it was like, the Irish are the coolest. This is the coolest concept anyone's come up with, the warp spasm.
Yeah, being a mother of boys, I think I'm familiar. I think that my face has probably gone into warp spasm before.
My face goes into warp spasm whenever the Nuggets are playing the Lakers. So, it's all,
okay.
all under the same epic umbrella. So I will say my confession, I also tried to prepare for this show, and I have at different times in my lives dutifully tried to read through epic poems, and I never make it very far. But this time I made it through the Cliff Notes version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I found interesting.
Well done.
Literally the first epic.
Mm-hmm.
But
Go
anyway,
to the source.
Yes, but this is why I'm not the guest for this topic. The guest we have, who is joining us at the table, is Jane Scharl, friend of the show. How are you doing,
I'm
Jane?
Great.
Good, and I suspect when I ask you which one you've read, it'll be more than Cliff Notes of Epic of Gilgamesh. We'll get to that soon. But first of all, you've been on the podcast before, and you are a member artist of the Arts Guild. But maybe tell the folks at home, just a reminder, who you are and what kind of art you do.
Sure. I'm a poet. I write a lot of prose, but most of that prose sort of serves the purpose of growing in poetry. So I'm primarily a poet. And I mostly work in lyric right now. I've done a little bit of work in narrative poetry, which I'll talk about that distinction a little when we start talking about epics. But I have not written an epic yet. I'm working on one. So, yeah, that is a little bit of my background.
Well, a little bit of background for me on this show. One of the things that made me want to have you on to talk about this is you are working on an epic poem, and you shared some of it at one of our recent guild meetings, and that was like, ooh. First of all, it was really good. And second of all, like the fact that you're even working on an epic poem, this is just interesting. But before we get into that, and I do want to talk about these distinctions that you brought up as well, because I think especially like the narrative epic line, there's probably some gray area that's worth discussing. What's your history with epic poetry in terms of like reading, enjoyment? What grabs you into the world of the epic?
Okay, so I have kind of a, traditional background in reading the epics. I read Beowulf and the Odyssey in high school. And then in college, I read the Iliad and Hesiod, Works and Days, and Ovid's Metamorphoses. So a couple of and Gilgamesh, a couple of the, the kind of basic ones. And then once I started studying poetry, I have a master's degree in poetry. That was when I started reading more contemporary epics. And that's, to me, a very interesting world. So, I don't know if you want to get into what epics are yet, but it's sort of connected to that. So I'll let you decide if you want to go into that yet.
Well, a part of me really, really wants to get into this because one of my lawyerly habits, I love defining my terms. But before we do that, did you ever have a moment where you're reading an epic, you're like, yes, this is right? I'll say for me, I had that moment in high school with, I may have mentioned this on the pod before, Anglo-Saxon poetry. So, some of the standalone poems are also Beowulf, just like this ethos of like fate and battling the sea and the sorrow. And it was like, yes, this speaks to me as a 16-year-old boy. That was my moment. So did you have a moment?
Yeah, for me, it was also Beowulf. The Latin and Greek epics are so long. And I really don't have a background. I know a little bit of Latin because I go to a church that's in Latin. So I know church Latin fairly well, but I don't know classical Latin very well. I don't know classical Greek at all. Even in translation, there's a language barrier there. But then when I sat down and read Beowulf, the language is closer. And I actually studied Anglo-Saxon for several years after reading Beowulf for the first time because I was so interested in the language, and I still do some study in it now and again. And that poem was really captivating for me. I think also there's a particular quality to that Anglo-Saxon tragedy, kind of like what you were talking about with the Celtic. There's the fate of the Greeks, and that is tragic. But there's something more just bottomless about the tragedies of Northern Europe for me. Man, it just feels so intense.
I totally agree. And Evangeline, I'm sure you're going to agree as well, but I'll sort of do my 2 cents before sending it over to you. the concept of Ragnarok just grasped my imagination. It was like, the gods are preparing for war. They know they will lose, but they still keep on fighting. It's like, oh, wow, oh, man, I'm feeling some stuff right here. And again, that just captured the imagination of 16-year-old me, Evangeline.
I really like Jane's term bottomless, because it does feel like there's so much there. And actually, sometimes I feel a little frustrated because I want to see a little more of the emotion of the characters. Maybe that's just me not being very good at reading an epic. And also like a few things that feel like they're in the way, like some of the formula. So I hope that we get into that, because I will, start getting into the story and be really excited that this battle is coming and the stakes are really high. And, the hero, like Cuchulainn, is like, extra. He's superhero. He's amazing, but then the army has to go through all of these different places. And there's like an entire, a couple of pages about the places. And I'm like, what is going on? So I know that's part of the formula of epics. And so I hope that we get to talk about it, and maybe it helps me get further into it rather than being a block when I come across that on the page.
No, and I totally get that sentiment. And that's actually a good segue into talking a little bit about definitions. So when I was doing prep for this, one of the things I did was just trying to get like, okay, what's the lay of the land? Like, what are the epic poems that are, should be on any like great books list of world history? So, I'm going through these typical lists. They've got the usual stuff, Gilgamesh, Beowulf, the Greek epics, the Latin epics that we talked about. But then we've also got several, out of India that are really important. And you keep going. It's like, wow, it seems like a ton of cultures, all of the big ones that we think of, have some sort of epic. And then I'm thinking, epic, is this a word that should really apply to all these various poems? Or is that just something that exists in our particular Western context? We're trying to sort of shoehorn all these other epics in. And that got me thinking about all the definitions in itself and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, Jane, what do you think? Is there a term epic that we can apply to everything from the epics of India to Beowulf, or is this more context specific?
That's a really interesting question. Not having read the epics of India in their original language, kind of hard for me to answer, because in translation, you just make compromises and changes. So I actually might ask some friends of mine who do translation their thoughts on that. I can't do that right now, but that's a really interesting question. So I think that even with all that variety, we can look at epics and we can say that there are a couple of characteristics that they do share. There is something that makes an epic. So things that you will see in an epic, it's going to be narrative. That narrative might be, actually almost always will be nonlinear. So that means you're going to get, like what Evangeline was talking about, that kind of chopping in and out of the action feeling in an epic. But there's going to be a narrative. It's not going to be a lyric like Gerard Manley Hopkins' The Windhover, for example. That's a lyric poem. It doesn't move from point A to point B in a story. So you'll have a narrative. You'll have a deeply rooted sense of place. Epics are about the relationship of humanity to place. As you get into the 20th century and the 21st century, place becomes time. So you have some epics that don't feel like they're about place, but they're about time. And it's the same sensibility where it's the human struggling with what it means to exist in a bodily temporal manner. So those are the first two elements: narrative, time, place, grappling. And then the third element that you will have in an epic is that it's going to be a story that's grounded in home. So the traditional division for epics is there are martial epics or war epics and home epics. And that's established by Homer because he's got Iliad, which is a martial epic, and the Odyssey, which is a home epic. And they're one story. And that's where Virgil kind of says, hey, look, I can one-up Homer, and I'm going to write one poem that's martial and home epic. Whether you think Virgil succeeds or not, I personally love Virgil. He's not Homer, but I have a soft spot for Virgil. That's kind of the world of the epic. And so I think that kind of gets to some of what Evangeline's talking about, and also some of what you're talking about, where you see epics arising from all these different cultures. Well, those are really deep human issues that epics are reaching towards and are digging into. So it makes sense to me that you would see epics coming from every language and every culture.
Yeah, those are interesting points. And as you're going, I'm sort of thinking, okay, maybe this is something we can kind of generalize. Because, like I said, when I started, I was like, okay, this can't be like, okay, I have my list right in front of me right now. So it's like the Mahabharata from India and the Kalevala from Finland and the Shamana from Persia. Like, these are all different. They can't all be. But when you look at them, like, I did my darndest to go through a plot synopsis of the Mahabharata for this. I really did. And it is apparently the longest poem ever written. It's 200,000 lines of verse, about 1.8 million words. And the plot is extremely intricate. And I gave up after about 2 paragraphs. But when you zoom out a bit, it does hit all of these points. It's narrative, but non-linear. There's definitely a sense of place. Your relationship to this place is these 2 warring like bands of distant relatives who are marrying, falling in love, killing, going to war with each other, all about this very particular place. And like you said, grounded in home. So it's very interesting how we get to that. Evangeline, were you having a similar reaction, or was it hitting you differently?
Yes, it really does. And yeah, that sense of place, I think, is really important for all of them. And you can actually, if I take a step back from my reading experience, which is just me and the page, I can visualize an oral bard giving this poem, performing this poem. And you could see how people would be excited as they talk about, the army going from here to here, or this is why this place has this name, because these things happened here. And for the people who know those places, that would be like a little cheer, like, oh, we know. I mean, you can see that. You can picture that. Yeah, we know that place. We've heard of that place. So I was going to ask Jane and you about the oral tradition, and if the ones that you just mentioned, the epics out of India, did you see anything saying that they were based on the oral tradition of storytelling and poetry?
Well, if I can kind of piggyback onto that, Evangeline, I was wondering something really similar, because I was especially focusing on the narrative but non-linear thing. And that was something I was looking at like, once again, yes, I see why that happens, but why does it happen? I was wondering, like, the reason that it's non-linear is it's sort of this oral tradition that gets kind of patched together. All these stories get sort of woven together by different voices, and it kind of gets a little jumbled. I hope that me piggybacking has still preserved the question for you.
Okay.
Sure, let me jump in there. Evangeline, in answer to your question, all of these old poems would have an oral element, because when I talk about place, it's in almost a political sense. So epic poems are stories of a people, even if they're not stories of conquest, which when you get to later epics, they're not always, but they're stories of a people. And so they need to be able to be transmitted. And obviously, literacy, it's a post-Enlightenment thing. So there's always going to be an oral element with poems that are written in Sanskrit or ancient Persian or something like that. All of the conventions of what we understand poetry to be are kind of up for grabs. So they're not usually as rigorously metered. They just have different conventions for poetry. So it would sound and feel very different than if you heard, say, a reading of the Iliad in ancient Greek. But there is still an oral and an oral element there. And then to what Matt was saying about the nonlinearity, yeah, I think that's today. So a lot of these poems are nonlinear, and I'm speaking mostly about the Western ones here, but I know this is the case with some of the kind of imperial Indian ones, where these poems are about the rise of a ruling family. Generally, they're about these older epic poems. This changes later. But the ancient ones are about why is this ruling family in power? And so the reason why the narrative is often nonlinear is because the poem starts what's called in media res, which means in the middle of the action. And the reason it does that is because everyone already knows the end of the poem. There is no drama in going from, oh my goodness, how is this going to end? Because everyone already knows the end, because they already know.
Is Aeneas going to successfully make it to Rome? I don't know. We'll see.
What? We're all descended from Aeneas, so. So the drama comes from, you start the poem in the action, and there's conflict, and there's emotions, and I mean, the first word of the Iliad is rage. There's this tension of emotion, and what you don't know is how is the character going to overcome the challenges. We know they're going to, but we don't know how. So there's a lot of flashbacks, and there's a lot of internal moments where the character maybe wanders off alone, and there's just narrative about them looking out at the sea, throwing rocks, or something like that, which can feel really weird if you're like, hey, get to the story. What happens? And if you think about it, everyone already knows. Yeah. They're already in love with this character. They want to spend all the time they can watching this person rise to power. Then it starts to make more sense. That is all caveat only about older epics. That does not apply to newer epics.
Yeah. That is super helpful. Thank you for that. And for dealing with my piggyback, which you incorporated. Thank you. So, and actually, now that you mentioned newer epics, I'd really love to talk about those too, because again, as part of my research, trying to get the lay of the land, I'm like, okay, well, let's look at epics from different time periods. And once you get to about, hundreds or so years ago, things get kind of wonky. And some of the ones that are coming out like today from a contemporary standpoint are very different. And I don't know quite what to make of them. So I'm guessing that the epic genre went through a big transition around the time when a lot of literature did. But can you maybe talk to that? What's going on with epics today?
So to talk about today, we have to talk about the 14th century, because that's kind of when everything changes and when the ancient world kind of no longer applies. So there's this little poem that you might have heard of called The Divine Comedy of Dante.
Oh, yeah. It's somewhere. It's mentioned somewhere, yeah.
And that's a game changer in the world of epics. So another element of epics that I forgot to mention, and I should have, pardon me, is that epics almost always, I'm really struggling to think of an exception. I'm sure some listeners will know of one. There's an involvement of the supernatural in time, in the lives of humans. So everything we were saying about place, about homeland, about war, and now about the involvement of the supernatural in time, when you get to Dante, it shifts. So you've had all this focus on the rise of the earthly kingdom. And all of a sudden, Dante takes all of these ancient things and he touches all these ancient tones and all these ancient elements that really ring with people because they want to be part of a kingdom that they can see rise, and he shifts it so that now the kingdom that we see coming is the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven. So after Dante, there's a shift away from that ancient use of the epic as the story of an earthly kingdom. And you start to see a lot more variety in how epics work. Again, this is generalizing, but there's a pretty clear distinction. So then you get on to some more famous epics like Orlando Furioso, Orlando Innamorato. Orlando is the Italian version of the character Roland from the Arthurian legend, Song of Roland and all.
Okay. I just connected dots in my head. That was helpful.
I figured that out. So you get those, which they're kind of more of the modern epic in that you have the lone warrior wandering through, and he's not a king. He's never going to be a king. And it's a little bit more about the story of a man becoming himself and overcoming personal challenges, but not with that social and political story behind it. And so then you start to go through, and there's always Paradise Lost, which I don't even know how to talk about Paradise Lost because personally I think it's overrated. The language is amazing. I know.
Man.
I didn't even
Hot take.
into this.
Hot take.
I don't have time for this.
Well, Jane, we've opened the door. You might as well just kick it open. What's your beef with
Some of the
Paradise
problem
Lost?
might be that I'm Catholic and Milton is Anglican. So there are just some issues there with how he approaches this whole story. But I think that, and this, oh man, he's Anglican and he cannot help but write a poem in which the most compelling character is the devil. I'm not saying that there's anything about the Anglican Church I'm not saying anything about the Anglican Church, but I'm saying that there's
You are speaking to two Anglicans right now, Jane. So
there's a rebellious streak in Milton that I think taints his poetry fatally. It's not a widely held opinion.
So first of all, in some defense of we Anglicans, I don't think we really count John Milton as one of our
You're
own.
right.
He had some pretty out there opinions, so I'm not even sure
Absolutely. I mean, I think, wasn't he even, did he have an Anabaptist phase? I'm not sure. I think he was very all over the place theologically.
Yeah, so I will not, he's not in the club, so I'll say that. But also, to your point, I had this thing for a while. I was working on this sort of fantasy story thing, and I was like, hey, you know what'd be fun? I'll incorporate things from Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen, because, it's this great drama of England. It's like, this will be super fun. And then I get to reading, it's like, oh, those are some quite untoward comments he's making about the Catholic Church there. And it's like, when you take a step back, it's like, okay, this is from when the Anglicans and Catholics were literally trying to kill each other. And they're like, guys, I can't imagine two views of the world that are more different than Anglicans and Catholics. And all of us right now are like, well, I can name a few, but okay, man. But yes, it was this was an issue in English epics.
So
I will
funny.
admit that.
Yeah, well, and I definitely have nothing against the Anglican Church. I have a lot of dear Anglican friends and all of that. But at the time, the Anglican Church was Protestant. It was protesting. Its definitive stance was in protest towards the existing order. Mm-hmm. Whether that protest was legitimate or not, whatever. But that leads Milton to me in a way that compromises his retelling so that it's no longer the same story necessarily as it in scripture. Yeah. It's got some really great lines. I'll give him that.
Yeah. It can be so hard to, take ourselves out of our own time period and enter into another time period and those things that just hit us, so strongly because of, our differences. It's just such a battle sometimes to separate that. So,
and I think Paradise Regained is it's not a successful poem. So, and I think it's really interesting that he does not succeed in telling the end of the story, but whatever. A lot more people know a lot more about John Milton, so it would be really fun if you had a contrary opinion on.
I did not go into this expecting Milton hot takes, but I welcome them all. I welcome them all. So a point you made a little bit earlier about Dante really stuck out to me, and I thought was interesting, where a lot of times, these earlier, sort of classically pagan myths, they're looking back to this is when our people were formed. This is a lot of times the sort of golden age in the mythical past we're looking toward. But for Dante, he's viewing this through Christian lenses and looking at it. No, this goal that we're going for is in the future. It's the kingdom of God is being built and will be built later. So that seems like that was sort of a whole paradigm shift with a lot of these epics.
Yeah, I think
is
so.
That right?
And I think if you talk to scholars, there's sort of a consensus that the concept of nationalism, as we think of it today, arose during the Enlightenment, which was swiftly coming when Dante was writing. Those ideas were being parsed out, and the Enlightenment, it's a natural consequence of the Renaissance. So when you get to the idea of nationalism, it becomes really difficult to have that same belief that your kingdom was specifically chosen by the gods. And interestingly, we do see a bit of a reemergence of that with America. But you start to have, I know, right?
Another hot take.
Oh, gosh. So you have the rise of Machiavelli and what's called realpolitik, where you have people looking at politics not as the gods acting through men, but as nations, sort of arbitrarily designated nations doing what they had to do to survive. That's a really big shift.
Yeah.
And Dante is living in the middle of this, the chaotic civil wars in the Italian city-states. And he's seeing that, wow, this ancient way of thinking about people and land and the gods, it's not holding up. And he was almost always on the losing side, which probably influenced his perspective a great deal. So I think you're right that what he's doing of shifting from the past and from getting his legitimacy from the past and looking towards the future, and that's a really interesting perspective. I think it's a good point.
Especially when Dante, I believe he wrote the poem when he was in political exile. So I think if you're writing as a political exile, you're not going to have too high a view of the people who are in power at the moment.
And
that might shift things.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so how did that...
Well, you can still see some of those older political... the poem is very political. Especially the Inferno is highly political. And you can see that he has an agenda of, the people he puts in hell is political. Like I said one on Twitter earlier today. Definitely not the only person to do that. But once he gets to the Paradiso and through the Purgatorio to the Paradiso, that sort of, the political elements do lessen. I'm not sure they totally drop away, but they significantly lessen.
Yeah, so sort of moving forward then, once this sort of shift starts taking place with Dante, then moving forward, by the time we get to what we think of as more the modern world, how does that all play itself out by the time you get there?
I'm going to kind of skip a little bit over the German Romantic era. Because that's sort of a topic in itself. Really brief.
If you must.
Super briefly, there's a lot of throwbacks in the German, in the Romantic era, English and German. It sort of starts in Germany, that's why I call it German Romantic, but it spreads all over. The Romantic poems are going back to those ancient and medieval themes and topics, and they're trying to pull them forward and using those same themes, but in a spiritualized sense. So they're talking about land and people and kingdom and spirituality and the gods, but in an allegorical way. So they don't actually believe in the gods and in a kingdom rising and all of that. It's not really until you get to, it's kind of sketchy because where you see this, so you see this happen with Wagner, with his music. With Wagner, it's probably idealized, but you see how it plays out politically when people sort of adopt that after in Weimar Germany. So there's odd thing happening in the Romantic era. We could talk about it for a long time, but it's not my favorite era, so I'm not going to.
It is mine, but that's okay.
But then you can say something about it.
I don't have anything to say, so especially specific to epic poetry within the Romantic era.
We need to talk offline then, because I have not fallen in love with it. That's probably something about me. But yeah, we need to talk about why you love it.
Sorry,
I want to know why. Yeah.
Oh, why the Romantic period? Oh, yeah, we could do that, but not on this podcast.
So
we'll table that with some more Milton hot takes. These will all be future shows. Don't worry.
Yeah, we need to have a debate on that. That'd be fun. So I get really excited once we get to 1915 and we get the cantos by Ezra Pound. Yeah, and that's where it gets fun. So kind of the last classical English epic is The Ballad of the White Horse by Chesterton, and that's right at the 19th century. Yay. Great poem. I love it. There's a great review of it by W.H. Auden, where basically he says, this poem is so bad, but I love it so much, which means it must be so good. I love it.
I love it. That's like the way I review every Godzilla movie. It's like, this is probably bad, but man, I friggin' love it.
That's how Auden felt about The Ballad of the White Horse. Yeah. So then you get to the cantos. And this is where all those things I said about what designates an epic really get turned inside out. Because obviously by 1915, 1916, and he was writing the cantos for decades, but by the 19-teens, the idea of nation had fragmented into something ugly and awful. And people were questioning whether the gods or God existed. And if God did exist, why would he be letting World War I happen? So all the things that had grounded epic poetry were all of a sudden, in a period of 5 to 10 years, gone. It no longer felt pure and lovely to love one's country. It was a problematic emotion because look what it had led to. And it felt naive to trust in God. And it felt naive to trust in all the sentiments that had given epic poetry its pull. But the sentiments of epic poetry are embedded in us. They didn't go away. We still want a home. We still want to feel like we're part of a kingdom. We still want to feel like the gods are speaking to us. So people had to find a different way to write about those things. So after the cantos, epic poetry becomes very, very interesting. And every epic poem deserves its own podcast after that point, because they're all attempts to take those feelings, take those sentiments, and write about them in a way that still makes sense in a world where the nation, the gods, the home, the land, who talks about the land anymore? Nobody works the land. Nobody cares about the land, you know? But when you read old epic poems, that's it. I mean, the land is almost a character in these poems. Well, now nobody even thinks about it. So these 20th and 21st century epic poems are fascinating because it's just the striving. And poets have not found a consensus on how to do this. So they're all very different. So I thought we could kind of go through a couple. We can't talk about them all, but a couple that people are interested in, or if you guys have ones that you know of, we can try to talk about.
No, that sounds fantastic. I'll say once we're getting into all the more modern stuff, I have dipped my toe in once or twice with some pretty big fails on my part. Like, for instance, I tried giving a go at this poem written by Frank Stanford in the late 1970s called, this is the actual title, The Battlefield Where the Moon Says I Love You. And yeah, it's very weird. And I was like, I dove in. It's like, all right, I can friggin' do this. I was in Arkansas. He lived in Arkansas. Let's friggin' go. I made about 2 pages. So if you have any in mind that you think would be, I'm especially looking at those of us who would like to, if I'd like to dip my toe in again, what would be good ways to do that? And which ones do you think are worthwhile? So yes.
So the one that you mentioned, The Battlefield Where the Moon Says I Love You, is really challenging because it doesn't have any of the conventional poetic elements, like stanzas. Mm-hmm. Isn't it just like all block of text? And it's
It really could be. Like any weird thing you say about the poem, I would be like, I think sounds
it's
great.
Like hundreds of pages long, and then it doesn't even have any line like breaks between lines. It's just line after line after line, and there's no stanzas and no breaks or anything. So just very overwhelming. I have not read it. I have seen it and read excerpts, but I have not read the whole thing. So kudos to you for trying. I'm glad you mentioned it. So the ones that I have read, I'm very interested in the English poets of that period. I do not unfortunately read poetry well in any language but English. So I cannot speak about anything that's not written in English. A lot of these later epic poems are not even in translation yet. So a lot of them I just don't know anything about. And that's totally my loss because I don't read in anything but English. So the ones I'm going to talk about are all originally in English. So the big guy that I think more people should read is David Jones. He's a Welsh poet. I think I talked about him the last time I was on here.
No, you did, and I sort of went down a rabbit hole researching him last time. So yeah, please do talk about it.
He's a Welsh poet, devoutly Catholic, which is part of why I like him, but not all. So when he wrote his first epic poem, he wrote 2 epic poems over his life, which is astonishing. So he wrote his first one, which is called In Parenthesis. And it is an epic poem about his experience in World War I as he was an enlisted man, not an officer. He was in the trenches with his buddies for a long time. And so In Parenthesis is his poem about that. And it's a really interesting poem. It combines poetry with line breaks and then sort of these little proto-prose poems where there's no line breaks, but it's very poetic language in a paragraph. It's dialogue where it's not specifically said who's saying what, so it can be a little confusing when you start reading it. But it's definitely a poem where if you just read it, it comes together. So you might get 18, 20 pages in and say, what am I doing? Keep reading for 20 more pages, and it will begin to congeal, and you'll understand what's going on. It's just beautiful because it captures these intimate moments where it's just the foot soldiers walking along, singing a song that they all knew from growing up in the same region of Wales and seeing the daisies blooming by the side of the road. And it creates these contrasts of, yes, World War I is awful, but David Jones writes in a way that you get a deep sense of the humanity of the participants. And he doesn't, apologize for the war, but you do feel like through his poem, he redeems elements of it, kind of in the way that Geoffrey Hill, who's a later English poet, says that language can redeem past events. And you get that sense that that's what David Jones is doing by remembering these beautiful, humane moments in the middle of devastation. He's redeeming past events in a very mysterious way. So I strongly recommend that poem for all people.
It sounds like maybe he's focusing more on an everyday kind of person rather than the heroic figures that were presented in the older epics. Is that common in modern epic poetry?
Yes. You absolutely see that shift from a conventional hero who has either political power or is chosen by the gods. Just get this person who's going through and observing things. And I'll talk about the last one that I want to talk about. I'll come back to that point because this poem that I want to talk about, which was published in 1998, does actually have kind of a heroic figure, but in an interesting and uniquely modern way. So that's really worth pointing out. For sure. Good observation.
Yeah, and it's very interesting too. You can almost see the whole progression of it, where at the beginning, Gilgamesh, it's the gods, and Gilgamesh is half man, half god, and he's the father of his people and everything. Then it goes in the Middle Ages, it's these heroes who may or may not be a leader or anything, but they're sort of this cool hero dude. And then by the time we get 20th century, it's average Joe foot soldier in World War I. So it's interesting to see that progression.
And I think that's a really important progression for understanding how poetry has changed. You see this probably most distinctly in William Carlos Williams. He's kind of the standard for that movement where he openly rejects the idea that poetry is about the unusual and the heroic. And he believes that art and poetry need to focus on the usual. And that kind of sparked a bit of a battle, because poets can't just make anything lying down. Which did you get his poem, The Red Wheelbarrow, a very famous example of a poem that's just about a normal thing. It's not one.
So much depends upon the red wheelbarrow, glazed in rain, beside the white chickens. I memorized that poem. I don't mean to brag, but...
That's great.
Well done, Matt.
Yes, so you said that the other poem you want to tell about is 1998, is that right?
So that's a poem by one of my absolute favorite poets. He's an Australian poet named Les Murray. He just passed away last November, I believe, or October, last fall. He's written a huge amount of poetry. So if anyone wants to get into Les Murray, you will have years of reading. But his epic poem is called Freddie Neptune. And he doesn't call it an epic poem. He calls it a novel in verse, which I think is an interesting decision on his part, but it is an epic poem. There's no understanding of epic in which it isn't an epic poem. It's really fascinating. And it's also a World War I poem, which is so interesting how World War I made such a deep impression just on everyone's psyche. I mean, 1998, that was long after World War I, but he was still writing about it, still wrestling with it. I think he spent a lot of time just thinking about World War I and how it has changed arts. It's pretty hard to overstate how much it changed the way artists thought about the world. But this is another World War I poem, and in this poem, the main character, Freddie, loses his sense of touch because he witnesses an atrocity that he just morally cannot handle with. So in response, he loses his sense of touch and he goes through the rest of his life without the sense of touch, but he feels like he can't reveal that he's lost his sense of touch. So the poem is about him trying to live in the world without this crucial sense, which, I mean, there's a really clear metaphor there of how after the war, morally, in order to survive, people had to shut down. They had to shut off a whole part of themselves. Yeah. And then they had to just find a way to survive without that essential part of their humanness. So the Ballad of Freddie Neptune is about that. And what's so astonishing about it, it's in contemporary English, but it's metered and rhymed. It's a loose meter. So it's not, iambic pentameter. It's a mixed meter poem, but it has a strong meter and it's rhyming throughout in sort of an open rhyme scheme. So it's not super regular, but there are a lot of end rhymes throughout. And so when you read it, it takes on that epic feeling, where you're just you're clinging to the back of the language and it's galloping along under you. That's how this poem feels. So I would say anyone who wants to read a contemporary epic, this is the one. It's really easy to read. It's long, but it's not unbearably long. It does that in media res, but it's really pretty straightforward. It's pretty linear. There isn't a ton of wandering around in time to distract you. And when it does wander in time, it gives you lots of clear signals. So I would give that one 5 stars out of 5 if you want to try contemporary epics.
Okay. And as you were saying this, I was, dutifully looking up the Wikipedia entry. It was like, hey, I could do this. I could actually do this. The battlefield where the moon says I love you may have done me in, but I can go with this one. I will add that to my list.
Yeah, I think you'll really fall in love with Murray's language. He's a very visceral writer, so it's so interesting that he chooses to strip his character of the sense of touch. Because when you read his lyric poetry, it's very touch heavy. So I think you'll really enjoy it.
Awesome. I'm really interested in that. I like that little touch of the supernatural and losing and, the metaphor of that. So I'll be adding it to my to-read list as well.
Evangeline, let's both add it to our to-read list and we can discuss it.
I think that makes a difference. The 2 poets that I've mentioned for contemporary epics are both religious. And I think that really helps them cope with what's going on. They're not at all pat about it. They don't say, oh, we'll just pray and everything will get better. But they got that, they believe in the crucifixion and resurrection, and that makes a big difference.
That's great. And, time has actually slipped away from us. Time, one of the themes of epics, but really quick before we go, Jane, you are in the process of writing one of these epic poems. So if you're at a stage where you can share it with the listeners, can you tell us a little bit about what you're planning with?
Okay, so mine is not linear. It's more along the lines of the Cantos or T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. Or David Jones has a second poem, which is called The Anathemata, which is not linear. So it's more along those lines. It takes place sort of in a out of time situation, but it's called maps. The central metaphor is how whenever you make a map, you have to accept a certain distortion of reality in order to communicate something about reality. So if you make a flat map of a sphere, you are erasing the reality of the sphere in order to capture the two-dimensionality of the thing. And you have distortion. For example, Antarctica looks massive on a flat map. It's not that big, but it looks huge. That's true of every single map. You cannot map something 100% accurately. So whenever you make a map, you're saying, I believe that something about this reality is worth capturing in a way that I can communicate it, but I am giving up something about the accuracy. I'm distorting it for the sake of that truth. So the metaphor of the poem is that our politics, our religion, our art, even, these are all maps that we use against the background of suffering. We use them to talk about suffering, but any attempt to map the reality of human existence distorts it and is ultimately unsatisfying. So the first section is called Legends, and it's about history and how we try throughout history to create these legends or these stories or narratives that make sense of our suffering, and they ultimately fail. The second section is called Scale, and it's about how we try to map this infinite reality of our soul's agony at the prospect of death we try to map that infinity onto something finite, and that doesn't work. You can't map infinity with the finite. They don't speak to each other that way. So then the third section is about the Eucharist and how in the Eucharist, it's this moment outside of time. It's a space outside of space. And so we can use the Eucharist as a map, but it's a map because it is reality writ both small and large. It's always bad to try to explain a poem, but that's what it's called.
I think you're doing a really good job.
Yeah, and like I mentioned at the start, you read a portion of it at our guild meeting, and we all loved it. But it sounded like from your plans, you plan on working on this for a very long time. Yeah, I've been working on it for about 2
years, and I have maybe 20 pages, of which probably 7 are going to be deleted in the near future once I work up the. They're really bad. It's okay.
Just copy and paste them someplace else. Don't delete them.
Probably going to be about 60 to 80. That's sort of how it feels like it's going to be. It feels like each section will take between 20 and 25 pages to work through. So it's going to be a while, but that's okay.
Such is the nature of epic poems, I understand.
And stuff like that. So I have to do a lot of scientific study for it, and that just really long.
All right. Well, Jane, thank you so much for joining us at the table here. And before we go, can we find you anywhere on Twitter, online?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter.
Where can we find you?
I think my handle is just Jane Clark Scharl, Scharl. Not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that's me. And then my website is www.jcscharl.com. And yeah, you can just kind of poke around. I have some poems out there if you want to see them, but no epic poems yet. So there you go. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, thank you again. Yeah, I really appreciate this. And, well, things are winding down at the Anselm Digital Pub. Fire's down to embers. Customers are trundling home. And I finally put the Epic of Gilgamesh back in my backpack. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of Anselm Society. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you all next time.